Hello everybody and welcome to this If Oxford event. Thank you for joining us. So there'll be Q&A sessions at the end and there'll be an opportunity to give feedback afterwards. And of course you've booked for this event possibly for free or use the pay what you decide facility already. And so if you'd like to make a donation at the end, that would be great. I think it's probably time though to kick off the event and we'll get cracking on the subject. So it's a pleasure to bring together Sarah and Julian. Julian was my MP when I lived in Cambridge, but now he looks after this thing called the Jesus College Cambridge Intellectual Forum, which is a little bit like a year-round festival, and he might tell you a little bit about that. But Julian, it's good to see you again. Now I'm in the other place in Oxford, but yeah, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Dane, and it's great to be here for this. So I'm now at Jesus College, and you can make whatever jokes about finding Jesus you like. You can see it just behind me as I stand out in the cold here. And I run a centre also, IF, Intellectual Forum, and we do have a whole range of things, trying to get amazing world speakers, discussions from our own people. So do sign up to our IF as well as the Oxford IF if you want to hear from fantastic people. So tomorrow night we have the former speechwriter for Mark Zuckerberg and for Elon Musk coming to talk about whether technology is good or bad for us. And so that should be fantastic. We actually had a really amazing event last night that you might be interested in, Dane. We had a fantastic woman called Sarah Bridle coming to speak for us. So Sarah, it's great to be reunited, having not seen you for a few hours. And so today we're going to sort of explore some of the things that Sarah's been working on, as you all know. And there's a few questions from me, but there is that chance to feed in some questions, which then I will try and put to Sarah. So if they're very good questions, I'll claim they were mine to start with, like any good politician. But tonight is really all about Sarah. So Sarah, we have a wonderful audience here. It's just possible, though, that not everybody has yet finished reading your book. If you haven't, it is available for free on Amazon, so I do recommend it. But could you perhaps just start off by telling us a bit about what it says and summarising some of the key aspects of this?
Well, thank you all so much for having me, and I'd be delighted to do that. Thank you, Julian. Just attempting to go into presentation mode. There we go. Okay, great. So so I'll just summarise some sort of some snapshots from the book, and I thought it might be fun if we did this in the format of a poll, a few polls, so just to see, really, make it a bit more interactive and hopefully spark some questions that you might want to put to us to discuss as we go through. So just to set the scene though, I mean, the reason why I wrote the book is because food contributes about a quarter of all climate change at the moment, and that covers going from clearing land for agriculture, putting fertilizers on the soil, burps and manure from animals, and transport and packaging, all the things it takes to get food to buy in the shops. And so this is about a quarter of climate change at the moment. If we were to stop burning fossil fuels, then food would be the biggest contributor to climate change. So hopefully we'll be on track for that. But also, as there are more people eating more food and eating more greenhouse gas emissions intensive food, then this red part of the pie is anyway increasing. And so my hope that we reduce fossil fuel usage, and over the next 10 years, then food will actually be where it's at in terms of climate change. So it's really important. And, I started off thinking technology could maybe fix all of this, but it turns out we will have to change our diets one way or another. It will happen even if climate change forces us to do that. So, we need to start doing that now and thinking about what we need to do in order to achieve that. So that's really why I felt that we have to start talking about this together with, it's a book aimed at the general public. It's aimed at in the food section of bookshops, for example. So that's my sort of motivation. And the good news is that different foods cause very different amounts of climate change. Now, I'm not going to do a poll on this question here, but which do you think causes more climate change out of an 8-ounce steak and chips, or a jacket potato microwaved with beans? You might be able to guess which might cause the larger climate impact, but the good news is that different foods cause very different amounts of climate impact. So in this example here, it's about more than 20 times more greenhouse gas emissions, more climate impact from the steak and chips dinner than from the beans and potato dinner. And that's good news, because if all foods contributed about the same to climate change, then we'd be stuck because we have to eat. So actually we can make big differences even by changing the quantities of some of the foods that we're eating. So the book really runs through a whole load of meal options. Really, when I started looking into this, I mostly wanted to know what should I eat and to help reduce my climate impact. And so it's really me just working through a day of food and looking at options for breakfast, lunch and dinner and snacks, and seeing, you know, what are the options and how different are they in terms of climate change. So some of the discussion is about breakfast options. And so we're going to launch a poll now and ask you, which do you think causes the most climate impacts out of these three options? And if you think that's too easy, then maybe also start thinking about which are the second and third largest impacts. So great if you would start the poll. Thank you. Great. So you should have a picture on your screen, a question on your screen saying, is it a bowl of cereal, a latte, or 2 boiled eggs? So I can see lots of votes flooding in here. That's great. Okay, I guess we'll wait a little tiny bit longer.
It's not 52-48, so that's all right.
Yes, it's not too close. Okay, great. So I think you should be able to see the results in a moment. And so can people see the results, do you think? Oh, there we go. Very good. Okay, so you can see there that the latte has won, and it's fairly neck and neck between the cereal and the boiled eggs. So I'm just going to move that out of the way so that I can show you. Okay, so I'm just going to reveal. I mean, I didn't tell you very much about all of this, so I hope this has triggered lots of questions that you've got now about all the different things, decisions that you'd have to make in creating this these meal options. So these are the numbers that I use in the book for the quantities. So we've got about a 200 grams, 200 mils of milk with the cereal, which is what the it's sort of pretty standard. It's a large latte, I have to confess. I didn't mention that earlier, but a large latte would have about 500 mils of milk, so more milk than for the bowl of cereal. And then we've got the boiled eggs there, and you can see the difference between the actual getting the eggs itself and cooking them. And really, I suppose the biggest message here for me is about quantity, about how sometimes it's not so much about cutting things out of your diet necessarily, but if you want to reduce your climate impacts, maybe trying to find out what's the biggest thing that's causing the climate impact, and then thinking about whether you really want that quantity or not. Okay, great. So I hope you've got lots of questions arising from that. I'm going to do another poll now. So which do you think causes the most climate change out of a chicken sandwich, a cheese sandwich, or a peanut butter and jam sandwich? So I should say it's about 50 grams of chicken, which is 2 slices, 50 grams of cheese, and then it's about 20 grams of peanut butter, because 50 grams of peanut butter is a lot of peanut butter in a sandwich. I don't know if you've ever tried that, but I did for purposes of research, and I can assure you it was a lot of peanut butter. So, okay, you can see lots of results coming in there. This is going to be close. I don't want to reveal too much, but yeah, okay. So hopefully you can see the results in a moment there. It is neck and neck between chicken and cheese, and peanut butter is right down there. So let's see. I'll show you the results now. So the answers for the average for production in Europe are as follows. So we've got, in fact, a lot of people are quite surprised to learn that cheese on average causes more greenhouse gas emissions than chicken. And I guess it really comes down again to quantities. So it takes about 10 kilos of milk to produce 1 kilo of cheese. and then we're back to the issues of cows, really, that about 5% of the calories eaten by a cow are burped out again as methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas. For chicken, it's more about what they eat, and we can come back to that if you're interested. And then peanut butter, although it's coming from a long way away, that turns out not to be a big issue because it comes by ship. We don't fly peanuts in just to make peanut butter. Okay, right. Third poll now. We've got 4 polls in total. So here the question is a small bar of milk chocolate, so 25 grams, a small regular small size packet of crisps, not a family bag, or a banana. So which do you think causes the most climate change out of those 3 options? Great, lots of votes coming in, fantastic. Okay, so the bar of chocolate has won there, and then followed some way behind by the banana. So let's have a look. So the biggest takeaway for me is that all these numbers are on the same scale I'm showing you, and so all these numbers here are much smaller than the previous slides. So actually, although there are differences, in a way, they're all quite small numbers. I guess I'm curious about why people always pick the milk chocolate, maybe because we've mentioned milk a couple of times, but you can actually see the milk is, it's sort of a similar size to some of the other things there, maybe the biggest, but not by a long way. There's actually more than 25 grams of milk in a 25-gram bar of milk chocolate. Did you know that? I didn't until I started looking into this, because we put powdered milk into milk chocolate, and so we actually get rid of a lot of water in the process. Great, and hopefully they've got a few questions about that. We'll see later on. Now, final poll. So this is now a question: which do you think causes more climate change? Spaghetti bolognese, chicken curry and rice, or fish and chips? So see what you think about that. And if you think that's too easy, then try and rate the which is second and third in your heads. There's not a button for that. Great. Okay. So an overwhelming win for the spaghetti bolognese there. So let's have a look to see how that went. I'm going to share that now. The first thing to notice, I think, is that these results, all these bars are much taller than all the other bars that we've looked at. So dinner, in this particular case, all these dinner options are causing more climate impacts than the snacks by a long way, and more than actually the other options as well. Now that was pretty tricky. I asked you a bit of a tricky question there. Which causes more climate impacts out of the chicken tikka masala and rice versus fish and chips? They're pretty much the same. But the mince, the beef mince, if that's coming from a prime beef herd, then that will be a very large component of the spaghetti bolognese there. And so actually, just looking at the quantities might be, the first thing to think about there, and maybe adding some extra vegetables if you want to reduce that. Okay, so that's just a snapshot of a few different fun sort of comparisons, but if you want to see all the details and all the links to the original literature, it's all in there, and it's a free ebook or available in good bookstores, of course. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there, and hopefully that's stimulated a few questions or some subject for discussion with Julian now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I mean, I learn something every time I hear you talk about this or read the book, and it's really been marvellous. So we will go on to questions from other people, but I want to take the opportunity to ask a few things myself first, because it's such a fascinating piece of work, and it's such a fantastically clearly presented book. But I want to just step back a bit. You didn't come from a farming background. You're not an environmentalist. How does this relate to cosmology? Isn't that sort of, I know everything's physics, but isn't that rather different? How did you get into this?
Yeah, so I wasn't sure how much sort of biographical detail to go into in that little summary. It's certainly not. There was actually quite a lot of astrophysics in the book originally, but my editor wisely suggested we remove it. So I've spent the last 20 years doing astrophysics research at the University of Manchester, and also University College London, Cambridge. And so basically about 5 years ago, I finished a big project, and my kids started at school, and I pictured them, you know, saying, what did you do about climate change, mummy? And you know, in 20 years time, and I say I looked at the stars and just thinking I can't really live with that. So that's a sort of a short version of really, you know, I was not a sort of eco warrior sort of person. I'd not really thought about it at all. But I just started reading about it and really trying to understand it, and discovering that these questions, you know, how much does each thing I'm eating today cause to climate change, is not easily accessible. And so because I could access the scientific literature through my university, and because I'm used to reading research papers and trying to reproduce calculations, I was able to go in there and, you know, reproduce calculations, and we're doing research on this topic now. So it's been, it's been a bit of a journey.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fascinating way to go. And I think the idea of putting numbers to it is really powerful. I mean, I've certainly come across people who are incredibly fastidious about only boiling the amount of water that they need to make a drink, and then put very large amounts of milk in it. And, you know, knowing what matters and what doesn't matter is quite important. David Mackay, who I know you know, used to comment that doing a little helps, but only a little.
Absolutely, yeah. I could say yes, absolutely, very good.
But I know, because reading through the book, it's one thing that I do love about it is you're not trying to be didactic. It's not written to say you must do this, you must not do that. It's about trying to educate and let people make decisions. But are there any clear recommendations that you would try and summarize? I mean, you know, clearly one is to have snacks rather than dinner, and to live off, you know, banana, mostly milk, chocolate and crisps. But are there any others that you'd sort of say as a rough summary?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely, you know, it's influenced by David Mackay in so many ways. I don't know how to cover it all, but, you know, basically very much influenced by his wonderful book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, which really looks at renewables and how that really matches up with our energy demands, and you know, in the attempt to get off fossil fuels. An absolutely brilliant book. And in that he often gave quotes in interviews: I'm not pro-nuclear, I'm pro-arithmetic. And so I'm very inspired by, you know, the whole presentational format that he used, and absolutely also that quote, you know, I probably adapt that to, I'm not pro-vegan, I'm pro-arithmetic. You know, I think it's more about going into this with our eyes open, and having information to have, you know, useful conversations where we can hopefully all get around the table and try to figure out what's doable. And I think I'm more interested actually in gathering and sharing data. I guess that's my background, data science, but also, you know, I'd love to see labeling climate impacts on every food packet, or maybe it's you know, scan a barcode and go to a web page, but that information propagating all the way from food production to consumers, I think, is my biggest recommendation, and supporting that process where we can. And then, you know, to factor in climate change into all the other factors that come about when we're choosing what to eat, including cost and convenience and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the labelling thing would be great, because one thing I've learned from reading the book is you can't just glance at something and say, oh, it's an apple, therefore it's this. I mean, you know, you'd have to do a lot to an apple to make it worse than some steak, but nonetheless. And so I mean, I have to say, I think the information piece would be really good. You know, and I do find it interesting how the sort of popular narrative is often that, you know, red meat, beef, lamb is the worst, and then if you cut that out and just have meat, that's better, and then vegetarian is better and vegan is better. But it's not that simple, is it?
Right. Well, I think that we all sort of saw that in the poll, didn't we? That, for example, the chicken versus cheese, that's a common misconception. I mean, it does depend on how these things are produced, though. Exactly the point you're making there, that it's not just one number. And then, yeah, if you look at the ordering, then certainly, if we look at the UK diet, as we've done in our research, then we look at what causes the most climate change on average in the UK diet. Then, you know, about half of the climate impacts come from animal products, and so, you know, that's on average something that people might want to start with. But something we didn't touch on would be, say, air freight. In terms of climate impacts, if you've got a portion of strawberries that have been air freighted, then that then puts it into that sort of impact category along with chicken and cheese and ham, those kind of things. So yeah, there's those kind of things, and then the oven use as well was something I was really surprised at. So I have to admit that when I first started looking into this, I went vegan, and I put the oven on, felt very smug about it, put the oven on for 2 hours with my jacket potato in there. Maybe I quickly nipped to the shops to get some extra green beans from Kenya, and actually if you add it all up, then it was actually a lot worse than a lot of meat, of animal product meals. So all those things can make a difference, as well as just the sort of red meat issue.
So I mean, the takeaway message: if you're going to cook baked potatoes, have lots of friends to eat them with, and then it's okay.
Yeah, there's lots of things you can do with baked potatoes. Yeah, so obviously batch cooking is a good one. Often, I did look into the calculations, and freezing things isn't as bad as you might think, because you might think, oh, batch cook and then freeze, but then you've got to like reheat it. So is that, but it turns out that that's not a big deal if you're going to microwave a baked potato. That's in terms of energy use, it's way better than cooking a single baked potato. And you can actually buy pre-cooked frozen baked potatoes, which I think some, I can imagine my grandparents turning in their graves at the thought of me buying a pre-cooked potato. But yeah, that's another option. Lots of options. But the thing about the microwave oven is that it's really just heating up the thing that you're going to be eating, whereas the oven, you're heating up this big metal box, and then obviously it's the whole room, because then that's not very well insulated. So there's lots of fun physics in there too.
So perhaps the message is actually, microwave during the summer, but then you can use the oven during the winter and just turn your heating off.
Right. So if you're going to have that oven on and you're going to turn your heating down correspondingly, then it's totally fine. Yeah.
So some useful tips. I mean, and then just the other thing, and I mean, we talked a bit about this yesterday, is because the other thing that people do talk about a lot is food miles. And your slides don't talk about this came this many miles. I think there's one comment where it does. And should we basically only be looking at how it moved, not where it moved from?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Tim Lang, the leading policy expert, when he coined the term food miles, he was actually trying to make the point that this is not a thing, but it sort of caught on accidentally, and so everyone's now obsessing about food miles. And there's lots of different things other than climate change to think about, obviously, about supporting local and self-sufficiency of countries and those sorts of things. But in terms of climate change, yeah, so if it comes by boat, then that's one thing. And we saw, actually, if you look closely on the banana poll there, that the transport by boat was included there, and it was still really, really small. But actually, if you send the same thing by air, then it causes 100 times as much climate impact as sending that thing by boat. And so that's when it starts to add up and become, like I was saying about the strawberries, comparing to something like chicken then. And so, I'd love to see a sticker on every fruit and veg item in the supermarket, which is maybe, not air freighted, might be easier than if it's just, people aren't going to be keen to put a big aeroplane on their stuff maybe, but some people might be keen to put a not air freighted sticker on their things. But in the meantime, if something can sit in your fridge for 3 weeks, then it can probably sit in the hold of a boat for 3 weeks. But it's things like berries, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, green beans, asparagus, those kind of things, which are generally air freighted.
And I mean, I'm going to slightly cheat because I think I know the answer to the next question, but it gives me a great opportunity to talk about another thing that you've produced that I think is wonderful, which are these fantastic flashcards. If I hold them up, because we just about see. So there's one side, and the other side is the top Trump side. Wonderful Zoom technology. It carefully edits it all out, but I hope you get a sense of what a tomato is like. And so you can compare. And so one thing I find fascinating is the different about seasonality. So the two cards I picked up here are tomatoes. So a seasonal 80 grams of tomato has the same emissions of 0.1 minutes of driving, which is not very much. If they've been done in a heated greenhouse, even in the UK, I think the figures are, it's 6 minutes of driving. It's 13 grams versus a kilogram of carbon dioxide. Should we also be saying what's seasonal? Do people know what's seasonal? Do they know whether it was a heated greenhouse? How much information can we realistically share?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because I mean, a lot of cherry tomatoes are mostly grown in greenhouses nowadays, but they're not heated, obviously, in the summer, hopefully. So there is a big difference. I mean, I think again, we'd really need to have that detailed climate information, and there's some amazing tomato growers that supply the UK who have really done a huge amount in terms of technology. They've got like heat saving things, which pump water around and store heat from the day and pump it around in the night, and there's a lot of great things that are happening, including in tomato growing, but that's not something that we can access easily, and so I'd absolutely love to see that information, and I think we just need consumers to really push for that. I mean, Walker's Crisps actually did put that on their packets about 10 years ago. So I don't know if anybody noticed on their Walker's Crisp packet, it said something like 75 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent about 10 years ago. Now, I have to confess that if I'd ever noticed that on my packet, I would have had no clue how, if that's big, is it good, is it bad? I mean, that's why it sort of gets a bit chicken and egg, as it were, to use a food analogy. But that's kind of, in my dreams, all the numbers in the book would be out of date soon. I probably shouldn't say that, but, I'd love to see detailed information. And on the other hand, in order to drive, to have consumers, citizens wanting that information, you kind of have to start somewhere. And so the best question I get asked with the flashcards is, is this really the number for all ways of producing steak, or is it just, where does this? How can you have one number? And I have to confess, I think if I hadn't come in as a cosmologist and said, astrophysicists saying, what's the number? What's the number? I want the number for steak, and all these now colleagues of mine doing food research are like, there isn't one number. And I'm like, I want a number. So I think, that we need to start somewhere. And that's kind of the spirit in which these numbers are provided. But then we have to follow that through by demanding more information.
So, I mean, just to add to this advert, as well as getting the book for free, or I do recommend the hard copies as well. They make much better gifts. Just think about it. If you're going to buy somebody a gift for a birthday, for Christmas, for choose your festival, a hard copy of Sarah's book is definitely a better option. Certainly, I've already bought quite a lot and given them away, and people seem to like them more than an email. But you can also get the flashcards for free online in soft copy. I'm afraid the printing is harder, and they're just to say, they really are fantastic for children, to play, to learn, and for adults to play and learn as well. But moving on from the advert, much I'm happy to always advertise your wonderful things. You've mentioned about how people need information so that we can make sensible decisions. That, what is 75 grams? Is that a lot for a pack of crisps? Is that a little for a pack of crisps, and so forth? But to what extent is it really people who should be acting? There's lots of other things where we don't say about, water quality, that we require the water companies to have stickers on the taps to say how polluted the water is. We simply say it's not allowed to be polluted. Actually, should it be individuals doing this? Should it be farmers? Is it supermarkets? Is it government? Should government be stepping in with a carbon tax equivalent, saying that you have to pay this? Should it actually be up to people to make these decisions at all?
Yeah, I do get a bit of pushback from my colleagues on this. I sort of don't always agree on this, because who has the power here really to make the difference? Is it governments? Is it supermarkets, farmers, food producers? And when you talk to supermarkets and food producers, as I do, then they say, well, we have to follow what the consumer wants. So if you look at what happened with plastic, now they're all falling over themselves to come up with things which are not fossil fuel based in terms of the plastics. And if you look at government, for example, the problems that government have had trying to introduce a sugar tax, I mean, it's going better now, but there's been times when that hasn't gone so well, and countries where health-based taxes have been reversed because it's just been not popular. So the psychology research on obesity, for example, shows that providing people with information doesn't necessarily change behaviour, but providing information does increase people's acceptance of interventions. Like, for example, sugar tax. So there is a lot that we can do in terms of, being accepting and asking for government interventions. And I think that's really what I would push for, more than sort of saying everybody needs to change their diet. I think that's not realistic to reach everybody and convince everybody to change. At the same time, I think there are, maybe it's different from obesity in the sense that, you know, I can think of a lot of people I've spoken to before I wrote the book who were already trying to do lots of things to try to be more environmentally friendly, and they're not always necessarily with the right information. So I think that there is, you know, there's certainly a number of people, or maybe people who choose to attend an event like this, who are really passionate about the topic and really want to do things. So I think that's, you know, there's also you know, a lot that we can do to help with that.
I mean, it's really a question about, you know, are people doing the right things? Like, if I'm allowed to mention somebody else's book, Mike Berners-Lee's book, How Bad Are Bananas, has a number of examples of things where seemingly good environmental things are actually negative. And so, you know, we could all rule out doing things which are, you know, inconvenient and worse. So knowing what matters is clearly quite useful.
Yeah, it's a brilliant book. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions coming. There's just a couple more that I would love to pick up on, because there's a lot of things that you have to try to compare when making decisions about what to eat. You know, if we're going to leave it down to individual choice, and for what it's worth, I agree with that. I think informed choice is easier. People saying, look, I've read about this and I'd like to cut back on steak, is much easier than saying steak is now a criminal offence, which I think would be catastrophically.
Not going down well.
How should people think about climate versus other things? I mean, for example, organic. You know, the book is quite clear that in some cases, at least, organic food is significantly worse from a climate perspective. How do you trade off all these different things?
Well, I don't know. Yes, I'm not going to pretend to have an answer to that. I mean, I think sometimes, again, it comes back to misconceptions. So there can be I think, you know, studies seem to show that people do tend to conflate a lot of these issues into one, and sort of assume that because something's organic, it must therefore be better for climate change, which, you know, as you say, is not always the case, and it depends very much on the product as to whether that's the case. On the other hand, I suppose both climate change and organic come back to an issue of biodiversity to some extent. So there's certainly the impacts of climate change on humans and our ability to get food, but then there's the long-term biodiversity impacts, which we'd have to weigh up against the short-term biodiversity impacts, I suppose. So I think that that it's very difficult to, you know, I think we all need to weigh things up against, you know, cost and convenience and taste, as well as the environmental impacts. But I think ultimately it'd be great to have, you know, environmental impact labelling more broadly than climate change, water use, eutrophication, so runoff of fertiliser from and manure from nutrients into water and so on, and ideally biodiversity, but that's incredibly difficult to quantify. So biodiversity as in you know, for example, pesticides and so on that kill off insects. So I think that actually the process of getting climate information on labels at the point of sale, it requires a whole load of steps which also have to be taken for the other environmental impacts that involve propagating information all the way down the supply chain and during manufacturing and so on, which actually is a real technical challenge at the moment. So that's something that is, you know, that's one of the barriers to it happening at the moment.
Now, one comment that's come in on the Q&A, and again, if you're watching, please do put things in there. That way I will ask the questions that you're interested in, rather than just the things that I'm interested in, which may well not be it. Is part of the problem that beef and cow products are just so cheap? You know, McDonald's can do a burger. I mean, I haven't eaten there for, actually, I mean, my last McDonald's was in 1995. So I you know, it's tap and take me or something, whatever the prices are. But they're incredibly cheap burgers. And so do people just not see beef as the luxury product that it once was? You know, is that something which needs to be challenged?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, you know, I mean, if we think about food waste, then we can also ask the question, is food in general too cheap, in the sense that we don't value it as much? And so, you know, I think that that's also true. I mean, there's, you know, lots of discussion we could have about subsidies of different types of food, and certainly the price of beef, it doesn't fully represent the cost of producing the beef, and it doesn't represent the cost the sort of negative externality, the cost to the environment of produced nut beef either. And so, you know, it'd be much better, in my view, if that was more representative. But on the other hand, you know, we have to then do that and support farmers at the same time, which is it was a huge issue with any kind of system change.
So there's an interesting question about that when you say we have to support farmers. I mean, over the last 100, 200 years, there are industries which have stopped and people have changed their employment. I remember when I was MP here, going to talk to the post office at one point where there were some proposed changes, and talking to the head manager there in Cambridge and asking what he thought about some change. He said, when I started, I was a telegram boy. You know, his point was, you know, we don't mourn the loss of telegram boys. We don't, or telegram girls or anything like that. You know, we're okay with the fact that technology has moved on. And I don't need somebody to hand deliver a telegram now, and I can email them or text them or whatever. You know, should we be trying to keep farmers doing the type of farming they're doing, or trying to find ways to help them to do something else with the farm, to still get an income, but from a different source?
I mean, first of all, there's a huge range in climate impacts across different farming practices. And so at the moment, we're not able to differentiate which piece of beef on the supermarket shelf is at the lower end and which is at the higher end. So, I mean, there's some people who've proposed, say, a meat tax, which, you know, you could propose a beef tax, but I feel that is, you know, that's rather unfair on the whole sector. And actually, if we could shift the farming practices of everyone to the best practices, then it would already make a difference. But on the other hand, yeah, I mean, if we look over the last 100 years, then there's been a lot of pressure and a lot of support for people to go into to producing more meat and more dairy. And now we're turning around and saying, actually, we don't need as much anymore. And that's, you know, that can happen over a very short period of time in a place where, you know, there's a huge amount of skill. You can't just, you know, I don't think, you know, can't just suddenly switch from being a beef farmer to, you know, being a different, you know, crop farmer. That's just totally different things. And it's maybe, you know, an area where there's so many issues with farming at the moment. It's hard to know where to begin, but it's not even clear it's profitable for some of these sectors to really even manage a farm. So it's incredibly difficult, people not really making a proper living from what they're doing and then being told, oh, now you've got to change what you're doing. I mean, it's a huge problem.
Yes, I agree, and that's been true of every technological change over the last couple of centuries, that there have been problems. But you know, it's probably quite a good thing that we moved away from horses to other forms of transport, for example, though, you know, very difficult to actually make it work. But you're right, we do have to get that right pace of change. Now, we've talked a lot about individual control and choice, but there are also institutions. And so what you choose to eat for yourself has some effect, and you know, people can eat less, have more vegetables with their spaghetti bolognese, they can cut out meat, they can do whatever they like. There's also institutional change. You know, do you get much response from large institutions like your university, for example, about mass scale catering and what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge opportunity, and there's been some really interesting studies. Actually, the University of Oxford led a really great study recently, which was looking at how placement of meals in a cafeteria affects uptake of the meals. And so there's a whole lot of interesting nudge things that can be done. So this is really sort of saying, you know, what if we have, say, some of the lower impact options available first. I think they found it was 1.3 meters, that you had to have a particular gap between that and the higher impact options. In fact, that was Emma Garnett as well at Cambridge, wasn't it? So this is, you know, there's lots of studies now being done on how can we introduce nudge kind of tactics, but also I'd love to see the numbers on menus to sort of be more aware. And I suppose then there's the question of whether you then go to the further option of actually removing some of the higher impact options. And I know there's a number of institutions who have looked at that as well. So I think that institutional and public sector catering has a huge potential role there.
So just for what it's worth, to advertise Jesus where I am, you know, as I said behind me. So we've taken the approach of not serving beef or lamb products, although, and when there's sort of, even for private dinners, the list of menu options just doesn't include any, and there's a little note saying, if you'd like these options, let us know. And I mean, it's been slightly strange because of coronavirus and so forth, but I think there have been so far a total of no complaints, because even people who do want to have the meat courses, I mean, I've gone pescatarian since reading your book, don't note the fact that the thing that they're being served is more often chicken, and they haven't had beef. You know, you can still cook a good thing. So there's a shift there, and various other things with vegetarian processors. And I have to say, the other thing that struck me quite a lot is that vegan food has actually become a lot better. And there is now a much wider range of food that actually tastes good. I've even found some nice vegan cheese.
Really? Oh wow! Tell me more about that later. Yeah.
So there's a thing that's come in just to pick up on organic. From Charlie Walker, who says, the film Kissing the Ground seems to show increasing carbon in the ground by organic farming would be a huge contribution. Do you think that's right? I mean, we haven't really talked about the role of any crops or anything else in taking carbon and embedding it.
Yeah, absolutely great point. Thanks for bringing that up. I mean, there's a huge role that soil carbon can play here. And yeah, there's lots of different farming practices that can increase that, including organic farming. It's in some, depending on the crop, and then there's reducing the amount of tillage, which reduces the amount of gases that come out of the soil. It depends on what's being grown. So I mean, if you think about fruit trees, is one of the things I've learned about recently, actually, where fruit trees, you might have thought that you're building a nice trunk there, and there's a lot of carbon in the trunk, and then you're getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to grow all of that tree. But actually it's the soil carbon, which is the most significant part of that you're actually getting soil under the ground in the roots, and retaining it there. So yeah, absolutely, soil carbon has a huge role to play.
And while we're looking at some of these sort of broader network effects, one thing we haven't talked about at all is the flip side of this. So we've talked about how what we grow affects the climate. We haven't talked about how climate affects the growth. Do you have anything to add about that?
Right. Well, actually, when I started out, I'd originally thought maybe half the book would be about the impact of climate change on food, and half about different foods and how they impact climate change. But it turns out there's not that great predictions. There is a chapter about that topic, but it turns out that it's very hard to forecast. So there are calculations which have looked at, say, the effect of temperature on yield. So you can sort of go back through the historical data, looking at the temperature in each summer and as a function of time, and how that affects the yield, and say that the number of days above 30 degrees has this much percentage decrease in the yield. But actually, that gives you a sort of average value for a smoothly warming world. But actually, one of the biggest impacts of climate change is these extreme weather events, and so they're very, very hard to predict. And if you think about the effect of extreme weather events on food, then that could have a big effect on harvests in a particular year. There's certainly a number of issues this year. And if you go back sort of to biblical times, then you had people keeping grain from one year to the next to in case there's a number of years with bad harvests. Why don't we do that now? Well, we do to some extent, but actually a lot of this is because we have international trade, we've got globalization, and we mitigate this risk of a bad year in one place by importing from another place to make up for it. But a kind of quite an interesting feature of climate change, particularly to do with the increased rate of warming at the Arctic, is that we tend to have more coherent weather patterns. So when we have, for example, a very hot summer in Europe, then that can also affect other places in the Northern Hemisphere. So that an even more sort of extreme kind of weather event is something that actually knocks out multiple bread baskets, as they're called. And that could have a really significant impact on the amount of food available in any one year. And of course, that's incredibly hard to predict. So the uncertainties are very big, but we can certainly see a trend in terms of the impact of the number of extreme weather events and the impact they have.
Yeah, I think it was an event that you and I were both at, where we're hearing about some of the consequences, and that there have been peach crop failure in the Carolinas. There's been some wine failures in France, terrifyingly. You know, and that I think there's a temperature threshold where you could lose an entire grain crop or an entire rice crop, which really would be an interesting way to to tackle this. And just one of the other questions that's come in here is what's the worst foods? Like, is basically beef and cow milk the thing we just need to prioritize avoiding? You know, what's the worst thing you can do from a food perspective?
So I'm just wondering if you want to see I've got a graph for that. I do like a good graph. I'm just trying to work out how to share my screen at the same time. So this is one of the graphs in the book, which I was wanting to see the answer to that question, you see. So if I click on share, does that work? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So here we've got, this is just showing the amount of climate impact per gram of protein. So if you are concerned about protein, and there's, you know, lots of things we could say about that, you know, we actually do get a lot of protein from plants anyway, and we all generally tend to eat more protein than we need. But in terms of protein sources which are kind of complementary to grains, then I've got, you know, a range of things here. And you can see different values. We've got lamb and beef at this end, and then there's a sort of a drop there towards milk and cheese. So per gram of protein, they're pretty similar for milk and cheese and ham. And then you've got things right down here. Quorn have actually provided greenhouse gas emissions information for all their products on their website, and they've really, it's amazing what they've done. And so you can see frozen corn pieces there. I've added some cooking versus the corn slices in the fridge cabinet. But you know, beans, if you cook them efficiently, then you can be right down there. Nuts again. So you've got a big range of different answers there. And as I say, these numbers are averages. So the beef number here, that's actually the European value. But if you looked at, say, South American beef, and you factor in the land clearance for agriculture, then it's you know, several times higher than that. So it really does depend a bit on the practices as well.
I mean, so I love this graph. It's actually one I screen grabbed when I first had a chance to look at an earlier draft of this of the book. I think it's fantastic. But just before you get rid of it, can you remind us a sort of reasonable diet? How much do we, you know, what's a reasonable carbon budget for it? You know,
yeah, so I struggle with this a bit. I mean, so the on average, the global average greenhouse gas emissions per person per day is about 6 kilograms. And that's actually roughly, you know, comparable to the value in the UK. The US is about twice that. But, you know, in the UK, we're about 6 kilograms. So this 45 grams of protein comes from, you know, having a sort of portion of chicken. So a chicken breast, for example. So if we have one portion, essentially, of a meat product, then, you know, you can see that you're already over the daily average. Per person per day, if you're going to have one portion of lamb or beef there. Now, in terms of a target, that's where it gets more difficult, because, you know, ultimately we want to have net zero emissions, and so we've got to factor lots of different things in there. But if we think about 2030, then the Kyoto Agreement, for example, says we should be halving our emissions by 2030. And so, just a, you know, very rule of thumb thing there, I would say let's try to think about going from 6 kilograms down to 3 kilograms per person per day. And so then you start getting into, well, you know, having you know, that amount of protein, a significant fraction of your daily protein from cheese and milk would already use up most of that budget. So it's about quantities again.
Yeah, so it's clearly a long way to go if you want to get into that budget, which I just find it quite, you know, interesting to think through. You know, 45 grams is not that much, but we do have to tackle that budget. We're running towards the end. We're aiming to finish at about past. There's still time for a few more questions. But what I've been burning to ask you for a while is, what's next? What are you going to do after this? I mean, is it going to be going back to cosmology? What's the plan?
Well, I'm a researcher, so that's where my my heart lies, and you know, I guess it's my bread and butter, as it were. That's what I'm paid to do, and that's what I love doing. Certainly, yeah, I'm not planning on writing another book. I've told my whole family if I start talking about that, then please please stop me. But I did love writing it, but yeah, sitting on my own writing is not my preferred role. So yeah, I'm still trying to figure that out, actually. I don't know. So I'm doing some calculations on land use at the moment. So I think this is, for me, what I got from the book, and the sort of the final chapter is about how much land we're using for agriculture. And I think that's really, really interesting. So, you know, if we cut back on foods that cause the most greenhouse gas emissions, it turns out that those foods also tend to use the most land. And so if we take, on average, it takes about 16 times as much land to produce animal products as it does to produce plant-based products. So actually about 80% of the world's agricultural land is used to produce food for animals. And so, you know, and most of the climate solutions require land. So for example, forests. And so actually, if we were to, in the extreme case, which I'm not advocating, if everybody went vegan, then we could, you know, use that 80% of the land better. For example, divide up with 16, that's 5%. So we'd actually free up 75% of the agricultural land if in this extreme case, everyone went vegan. So, you know, that would be a huge amount of land that could massively help with climate change. And it turns out the amount of carbon sequestered by that amount of forest is actually equal to about 3 kilos per person per day. So it would actually make up for what we're eating if we halved our emissions. So I think land is where it's at. I think that we need land use strategy for the UK and globally. We need to figure out how to incentivize change in terms of land use, and that's, you know, I'm really excited about working with social scientists. That's one of the projects we're currently looking at, because I'm a data scientist and a technology enthusiast, but I've got to admit that you know, we do have quite a lot of the solutions, but we can't seem to figure out how to actually get on with implementing them. And so I think this is a really interesting area of collaborating with social scientists, bringing some of this quantitative information, sort of dashboards and that kind of thing, into those conversations, and then figuring out how to all work together. That's the big thing we need to do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from food.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it's a fascinating challenge. I'm pleased that there is a way of sort of getting towards net zero, because one of my concerns, of course, to get to net zero across food, we would otherwise have to not eat anything, and I think that's a slightly too extreme diet.
Yes.
And of course, I mean, you know, there's lots of things we haven't touched on, you know, and I guess they're more on the social science piece than the day side. You know, we still have food poverty. You know, while we have millions of people who are obese and producing, you know, far too much climate emissions, but also unhealthy because they're eating too much, we also have many millions who are starving and not getting enough. You know, there's a huge distributional problem, which is a political and social science problem rather than an evidence-based one. I don't know if you have sort of thoughts on that. And
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be learned from looking at approaches that have been used in health settings, and also, you know, ultimately we need to transform the food system. This is not serving, you know, it's not sustainable, the current food system, not least because if we have climate change happening, then it's going to change it anyway. And so we need a transformation, and that's, you know, that's the language that's being used in this research area. It's not just a crazy idea. And how do you actually have transformational change, and how do we then try to solve multiple problems at once as we do that? And so one of the exciting things then is to sort of say, well, if we're going to go into schools, for example, and look at schools catering, how can we have a conversation which involves talking about health and greenhouse gas emissions and environmental impacts at the same time, and bringing those things together and working together across the space of people who work on health, people who work on environmental impacts. And so, you know, in my dreams, we'd have a dashboard where we could like change, you know, different interventions we could make, you know, for example, on canteen menus, or, you know, minimum tillage in farming. We talked about soil carbon earlier on. And move those sliders on a dashboard, very much inspired by David Mackay's 2050 calculator, and then see the impacts on not just climate change, but health impacts, and see all that in one go, and be able to play around with that and try to find our own solutions.
yeah, I mean, that would be awful. I mean, as it happens, as you probably know, red meat is also some of the worst things to eat. I mean, I think it's the least safe thing to eat is, I think, fugu that hasn't been prepared properly. But otherwise, there is evidence that processed red meat, some of the work from Michael Marmot's, is actually, as it happens, quite bad for your health as well. So at least they point in a slightly similar direction. So we're almost out of time. But just one thing before you go. So we've talked about your book. And just in case anybody hasn't got it, it is available for free as an ebook from Amazon, or I really recommend buying presents for all of your friends, getting more friends to buy it as presents for them as well. I recommend that as well. There's these wonderful flashcards we've talked about. I know you also have some other resources available that people might want to have a look at.
Yeah, so we basically, a group of us across the UK, enthusiastic about sharing the academic and scientific consensus on how different foods contribute to climate change. So again, we're not trying to push a particular solution. We did a stand at the Royal Society Summer Science Exhibition last summer, and we put together a number of resources for that, including these flashcards. There's a game where you can click on the lowest impact food, and it's quite addictive, and you can get all of these things for free on the Take a Bite Out of Climate Change website. And so that's, we've got those. We've also got a calculator where you can put in all those recipes, all those food combinations from the book, and change the quantities if you want to have put your own different quantities in there, and see how things add up. So yeah, we're passionate about making connections with people who want to know more about this topic, and it's kind of it's a fun thing that we're doing for it's all free and available to anybody that wants it.
So there you go, a free book, a calculator, a card game, a computer game. What else could you want? Sarah, thank you so much for all the work, but also for being so entertaining here and so informative for everybody here, and for answering so many questions. So thank you very much to you. Thank you very much to IF Oxford for inviting me to be here to listen to Sarah again. Dane, over to you.
Thanks so much, Julian. That was really good fun. Sarah, brilliant. I really like the idea of talking about these absolute numbers. And then obviously as the conversation went on, you're sort of talking about social sciences and how people are changing behaviour. I did catch your note about talking about physics being your bread and butter, which triggered the idea of idiom and metaphor, and the kind of notion that the cultural space and art can be a way of thinking differently about how we kind of change our behaviour. And there's, just to plug another event, we've got a play that's being launched on Monday, working with some sleep scientists of art that gets people thinking about sleep, circadian rhythms, behaviour change, thinking about using apps at night, phones and things. And just wondering, areas for collaboration in the future might be a way of possibly working with poets, theatre, other sorts of artists to kind of think through how do we, you might, the imagery of roasting a turkey, roasting a potato, the cultural kind of norms, how do we kind of get people thinking differently about what do we need, what would we actually enjoy, rather than feeling guilty about eating our steak, we might positively want to, I personally don't really like the idea of corn, but I'd much rather have a mushroom, just an ordinary mushroom, But anyway, it's sort of possibly some more food for thought there.